It was more than just a store. It was a cathedral. If you were a music lover in the 20th century, the yellow and red shopping bag was your badge of honor. It was the place where rock stars stood in line with teenagers, where the bins were bottomless, and where no music, no life wasn't just a slogan, it was a religion. At its zenith, Tower Records was an international empire. 200 stores, 30 countries, over $1 billion in annual revenue. From the neon sprawl of Tokyo to the historic streets of London and the powerhouse corners of Manhattan, Tower Records was the heartbeat of the music industry. If it was pressed on vinyl, recorded on tape, or burned onto a CD, Tower had it. But in 2006, the music stopped. The giant that had survived the transition from vinyl to cassette and cassette to CD couldn't survive the digital revolution. Thousands of employees were fired overnight. The yellow signs were torn down. The bins were emptied. We are told the story is simple. The internet killed the record store. But the internet was just the final blow. The real story of Tower Records is one of explosive ego, massive debt, and a refusal to see the world shifting beneath its feet. This is the complete history of the greatest record store in the world. This is the rise and fall of Tower Records. What made Tower different? In an era of corporate retail, Tower Records was a mom-and-pop shop that happened to be a billion-dollar corporation. Every store had its own soul. The managers were given total freedom to stock what their local customers wanted. A tower in Nashville felt like a country music museum. A tower in New York was a temple of jazz and classical. A tower in Berkeley was a hotbed of punk and revolution. They weren't just selling plastic, they were selling discovery. The staff weren't associates, they were music nerds. They were the gatekeepers of cool. If you didn't know what you were looking for, the person behind the counter, usually wearing a band t-shirt and covered in tattoos, would guide you to your next favorite obsession. The brand was built on 3 pillars: massive selection, local soul, and late hours. Most record stores closed at 6 p.m. Tower stayed open until midnight, 365 days a year. It was the only place in town where a midnight release was a cultural event. For the music industry, Tower was the town square. Every empire starts with a single person. For Tower, that was Russell Solomon. Russ wasn't a corporate shark. He was a high school dropout who loved music and people. The story begins in 1941 inside the Tower Theater building in Sacramento, California. Russ's father, Cassius Solomon, owned Tower Drugs. The drugstore had a small rack of 78 RPM records that weren't selling. Russ, just 16 years old, asked his dad if he could take over the record section. He started selling used jukebox records for 3 cents each. He realized early on that people didn't just want the hits, they wanted the weird stuff. They wanted the B-sides. After a stint in the Army and a failed first attempt at a wholesale record business, Russ returned to Sacramento. In 1960, he opened the first official Tower Records store on Broadway. He named it after the theater next door, but the name would eventually come to represent a towering achievement in retail. In 1968, Russ took the biggest gamble of his life. He opened a store in San Francisco at Columbus and Bay Street. People told him it was too big. They said no one could fill 5,000 square feet with records. Russ proved them wrong. Within weeks, the San Francisco store was the epicenter of the Summer of Love. It was the first superstore. It was the blueprint for everything that followed. Russ Solomon had discovered the secret formula. If you build a library of sound, they will come. In 1971, Russ Solomon decided to stake a claim in the heart of the music world, West Hollywood. The opening of the Tower Records on the Sunset Strip wasn't just a business expansion, it was the birth of a landmark. This store was built by the people who worked there, literally. Staff members helped with the construction and interior design. The Sunset Strip location became the most famous record store on the planet. It was open 365 days a year until midnight. Because of its location, it became a playground for the elite. If you were an artist, you went to Tower to see where your record was placed. If you were a fan, you went to Tower to see the artists. It was the only place where the hierarchy of fame collapsed. Everyone was just a fan in the aisles. This store solidified Tower's reputation for having everything. If it existed, it was on the strip. In 1979, Tower Records made a move that most American retailers feared. They went to Japan. Starting as a small branch of MTS Inc., the Japanese operation exploded. In 1980, they opened in Sapporo, followed by a massive flagship in Shibuya. Japan fell in love with Tower Records. To the Japanese youth, the yellow shopping bag was the ultimate symbol of Western cool. The Japanese stores were even cleaner, more organized, and more obsessed with depth than the US locations. This expansion was the beginning of Tower's global footprint. Over the next decade, they would open in London, Hong Kong, Singapore, and across South America. Tower wasn't just a store anymore. It was America's greatest cultural export.
The mid-'80s brought a technological shift that would make Russ Solomon a billionaire: the compact disc. When the CD was introduced, the music industry found a literal gold mine. Labels could now charge $15 to $18 for an album that used to cost $8 on vinyl. More importantly, every music lover in the world decided they needed to upgrade their collection. Millions of people went to Tower to buy the same albums they already owned, just in a new format. Cash was flowing into Tower Records faster than they could count it. Between 1985 and 1995, Tower was the undisputed king of retail. They were opening megastores that occupied entire city blocks. In New York, the Greenwich Village location became a 4-story temple of sound. Tower's peak wasn't just about sales, it was about authority. In 1983, they launched Pulse magazine. Originally a free giveaway, it became a legitimate national publication with a circulation of hundreds of thousands. It gave Tower the power to make an artist. If Pulse gave you a cover story, you were a star. Inside the stores, the art gods, the in-store display artists, were creating museum-quality murals. These weren't corporate posters, they were hand-painted works of art that celebrated the music. Tower had created a 360-degree immersive world. You didn't just go to buy a CD, you went to live in the music for an hour. By the late 90s, Tower Records was pulling in over $1 billion a year. Russ Solomon was a legend, often seen walking his stores in a simple shirt chatting with clerks. He seemed untouchable. But the seeds of destruction were already being sown in a small office in Seattle and a dorm room in Boston. The bankruptcy. This section covers the perfect storm that dismantled the empire. The rise of predatory big-box retailers, the billion-dollar debt trap, and the illegal price-fixing scandal that alienated the very fans who built the brand.
By the late 1990s, Tower Records was facing a new kind of enemy. It wasn't other record stores, it was the big-box retailers. Companies like Best Buy, Circuit City, Target, and Walmart realized that music was the ultimate loss leader. These giants didn't need to make a profit on CDs. They sold the latest Britney Spears or Metallica album below cost just to get you into the store. They banked on the fact that while you were there for a $10 CD, you might walk out with a $500 television or a $20 toaster. Tower Records, whose entire business model was built on the margin of music sales, couldn't compete. They were paying premium rent for prime real estate on the Sunset Strip and Broadway. They had thousands of expert staff members on the payroll. Tower was a full-service experience in a world that was moving toward self-service efficiency.
In 1998, at the very moment the industry was beginning to plateau, Tower Records made a fateful decision. They took on a $110 million loan to fund an even more aggressive global expansion. To the executives in Sacramento, it seemed like common sense. They had seen 40 years of uninterrupted growth. But this irrational exuberance lacked due diligence. They were building massive, expensive megastores in international markets just as the ground was beginning to shake. This debt would become the millstone around the company's neck. Suddenly, they weren't just working to buy more records, they were working to pay the interest on their loans. Every dollar spent on a new store in Argentina or Hong Kong was a dollar they didn't have to invest in the coming digital revolution. In 2002, the brand's reputation took a devastating hit. Tower Records, along with major labels and other retailers, was sued by 41 states for CD price fixing. The lawsuit alleged that the industry had used minimum advertising pricing, or MAP, to artificially keep CD prices high, preventing discounters like Best Buy from offering lower prices. It was estimated that between 1995 and 2000, consumers were overcharged by nearly $500 million. Tower agreed to pay a portion of a $143 million settlement. But the financial fine wasn't the worst part. It was the loss of trust. In the eyes of the public, the temple of music had become a greedy cartel. This bitterness made the next era of music consumption even more inevitable.
In 1999, a 19-year-old named Sean Fanning released a program called Napster. It was the big bang of the digital age. For the first time, you didn't have to go to Tower to get the B-side. You didn't even have to buy the whole album. You could get the one song you wanted for free in seconds. The record industry's response was to sue. They spent millions on lawyers trying to stop the tide. Tower's leadership largely ignored it at first, believing that people would always want the physical experience. But they were wrong. A generation of teenagers who used to spend their Friday nights in Tower aisles were now spending them in front of their monitors.
By 2004, the math simply didn't work. Tower had lost money for 13 straight quarters. They couldn't make a $5.2 million interest payment on their massive debt. On February 9, 2004, MTS Inc., the parent company of Tower Records, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The plan was to restructure, wipe away $80 million in debt, and find a buyer. But finding a buyer for a record store in 2004 was like finding a buyer for a stable in the age of the Model T. The creditors took control, and for the first time in 40 years, the Solomon family no longer owned the company they built. The legacy. In this concluding section, we witness the heartbreaking auction of the company's assets, the going out of business sales that gutted the Sunset Strip, and the strange, resilient afterlife of the brand in the 21st century. The 2004 bankruptcy was supposed to be a fresh start, but the restructuring deal came with crippling restrictions. The new owners, bankers, and creditors didn't care about the soul of the music. They cared about the bottom line. They slashed inventory, cut staff, and essentially turned the vibrant cathedrals of sound into hollow warehouses. By 2006, it was over. On August 20th, Tower Records filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the second time. This time, there was no talk of restructuring. The goal was to find a buyer to keep the lights on through the holiday season. But when the auction began on October 6, 2006, the only serious bidder wasn't another music retailer. It was a liquidation firm called the Great American Group. They bought Tower Records for $134.3 million. Their goal wasn't to save the company. Their goal was to kill it and sell the pieces.
What followed was a funeral that lasted 2 months. Across the United States, 89 Tower Records locations began their going out of business sales. The scenes were surreal. People who hadn't stepped foot in a record store in years suddenly returned to pay their respects and scavenge the remains. On the Sunset Strip, the mood was particularly dark. This was the store that had hosted the Rolling Stones and Elton John. Now the bins were being torn apart. Employees, many of whom had worked there for 20 or 30 years, were seen crying in the aisles.
On December 22, 2006, exactly 46 years after Russ Solomon opened his first store, the last Tower Records in the United States closed its doors. The final store to shut down was in Mountain View, California. At 5 p.m., the lights flickered and went out. The empire of sound was officially silent.
Did Tower Records fail because of the internet? That's the easy answer, but it's not the whole truth. Tower failed because of the debt trap. The $110 million they borrowed in 1998 meant they couldn't afford to lose money for even a single year. When the industry shifted, they had no cushion. It failed because of the big box war. By the time they realized they couldn't compete with Best Buy on price, they had already lost their casual customers. But perhaps most tragically, it failed because it was too big to be small. Tower's magic was in its massive selection, but that selection required massive rent and massive staffing. When the superstore model became a liability instead of an asset, the company had nowhere to go. However, if you go to Tokyo today, the dream is still alive. Because the Japanese branch had been spun off as an independent company years before the bankruptcy, Tower Records Japan survived. It remains a multi-billion-dollar business, proving that with the right cultural support and business management, the record store model can still thrive. And in a twist no one saw coming, the brand returned to its roots. In November 2020, Tower Records relaunched as an online retailer, selling vinyl and cassettes to a new generation of analog enthusiasts. They even opened Tower Labs in Brooklyn, a physical space for artists to connect. Russ Solomon once said, "The stores were like children to me. You hate to see them go." But while the buildings are gone, the influence of Tower Records is everywhere. Every independent record store that survives today carries a piece of the Tower DNA, the belief that music isn't just a commodity, it's a community. The yellow and red signs may have faded, but for anyone who ever spent a Friday night lost in the stacks, the melody remains.